In the past 2 weeks, we've talked about the possibility of voter fraud during the upcoming election. We always offer solutions to the problems we identify, and one of the solutions you can engage in is to volunteer at your local election board, polls, etc. In this manner, you may be able to oversee that your local elections are fair and impartial. Now on to the subject for this week. Much is being said about the 4 executive orders that President Trump signed over the weekend in response to the inactivity of Congress to pass another stimulus bill. Regardless of who initiated the latest stimulus, it amounts to a massive amount of money. Many have begun to speculate as to just who or what is going to pay for all the money doled out. We suggest that you go to your nearest mirror, where you will find the answer. Most Americans are no longer taught the history or importance of a republic, as we are supposed to be. The strength of this system is due to the limitations provided by only granting certain enumerated powers to the federal government. These limitations were the key to controlling federal spending. Today, many Americans don't realize that our nation wasn't always buried in debt. Talks of a stimulus package would have been unheard of during the first 140 years. It wasn't the federal government's place to bail out the states. In fact, it was completely the opposite. The states bailed out the federal government. Most Americans do not know the history of how the federal government was sustained from the beginning of the country and how we paid off any debts that were incurred as a result of going over budget. Briefly, the federal government was sustained by tariffs and excise taxes. If they went over the amount of taxes collected, the states were then required to come up with the difference, proportionately based on their populations. This kept the size of the central federal government to a limited size. During a war, any debt incurred was then paid off by issuing bonds which the government paid back over time. This process started to change as a result of the Civil War and the Marxist outlook of the governments, both in the North and the South. The manner in which they paid for a great deal of the war was by issuing paper money for the first time. Before that, the Constitution said that gold and silver were money, not paper. After all, the Continental Congress had issued paper money during the War for Independence, and they found out just how bad such a monetary system was when the issued paper money became worthless because it was not backed up by gold. It was so bad that they still used the saying into the 20th century that something that was worthless was not worth a continental. The issuing of paper money during the Civil War created inflation, which was a hidden tax on the people, and by the end of the war, the two governments robbed their people of huge amounts of wealth due to inflation. In the North, it amounted to 50% of the value of all property, real and personal, being taken from the people. In the South, it amounted to 99%. The reason for the greater inflation in the South was twofold. They lacked both sufficient gold backing for the Confederate dollar compared to the North, and they lacked the economic base that the North had. When the war was over, many states in the South were then saddled with bonds to help the federal government pay for the war and Reconstruction, which finally were paid off 100 years later in 1966 or so. The federal government imposed an income tax during the war, but then it was dropped after the war. Very soon, however, the income tax was again attempted, at which time the Supreme Court ruled the tax unconstitutional. The Constitution did not allow the direct taxation of the people by the federal government. In fact, in 1794, James Madison stated, quote, "The government of the United States is a definite government, confined to specified objects. It is not like the state governments, whose powers are more general. Charity is no part of the legislative duty of the government," unquote. It looks like Pelosi and many others within our federal government could take a lesson or two from our founders. You see, our founders understood that such an income tax would give inordinate power to the government, and there would be little barrier to the government taxing as they saw fit. Keep in mind that the income tax is a plank out of the Communist Manifesto in the 10-step program to communize a country. Ultimately, The Marxists in America convinced enough people that an income tax was necessary, and the Constitution was changed with the 16th Amendment permitting such a tax. After this time, the federal government no longer looked to the states for overruns in the budget, and the whole process was reversed, where the federal government started to help finance the states. This then gave power over the states by the federal government. The check and balance between the states and the federal government was broken. At the same time, the Federal Reserve was created, which was the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. So what happened was that the people were convinced to accept a paper money system controlled by a few at the top who controlled the big banks. Jumping forward to today, when the government runs out of money, they either run to the Federal Reserve or issue bonds bought by big banks or even foreign governments. Today, a great deal of these bonds are owned by China. Relative to paying for the massive amounts of money being doled out to the people over the pandemic, the monies are being paid for by two things. One, the issuing of bonds to be paid back with interest, and two, inflation. Inflation of the money supply over the course of a century has reduced the value of a dollar to 1 cent. In other words, the federal government has robbed the people of 99% of the value of their money. What cost $1 in 1914 now costs the people basically $100. It's an invisible tax. And as socialist economists have said, not 1 in 1,000 people know what is being done to them. All they know is that prices keep going up, and they blame the businessman rather than the government. And that is how the recent stimulus will be paid for. At first it will look like a boon, but then the cost starts injecting itself into the economy like a cancer. Now we see that the only difference between most Republican leaders and Democrats is simply the amount of debt we're placing on the American people. It is no different than borrowing money from a loan shark. And the consequences are even worse in the long run because it can destroy the country in the long run, or at least our freedom. The solution to our country's economic problems is not a bailout, but allowing the people to get back to work. Get in touch with your congressman to seek this solution rather than creating more debt. Open up the country. Freedom is the cure.